Sierra Clark arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta just before 8 in the morning. She walked confidently, dressed in an impeccable white suit, low-heeled shoes, and carrying a personalized leather briefcase with her initials. The only daughter of billionaire Wesley Clark, founder of Ascendant Air, Sierra avoided using her surname as a calling card. She preferred to earn her space on her own merits, always emphasizing her competence above family prestige. At 32 years old, she was already a respected executive, responsible for major expansion projects for her father's airline. That specific day, Sierra was there to oversee the renovation of the company's premium lounge, a luxurious space that would serve VIP passengers. The main hall was bustling, hurried passengers tugging wheeled suitcases, while families tried to calm crying children in the endless boarding lines. Sierra was walking toward gate D12 when she noticed a discreet commotion near the security area. A young black man, no more than 20 years old, was being harshly confronted by 2 TSA agents who were searching his backpack with visible hostility. The scene deeply moved Sierra. She felt a familiar unease, an uncomfortable sense of injustice. Unconsciously, she took a few steps forward, getting closer than she should to the situation. It was then that she felt a piercing gaze directed at her. A tall white police officer, with a ruddy face and an arrogant stance, was quickly coming her way. In that moment, Sierra had no idea that this encounter would completely change her day, and perhaps even her life. Officer Jennings wasted no time as he approached Sierra, walking with firm steps and his hands resting on his belt, near his gun and handcuffs. He had a clearly irritated expression, his eyebrows raised and his jaw set. Sierra quickly checked his identification, which displayed the name M. Jennings. He positioned himself very close to her, invading her personal space, and spoke in a harsh tone. "Miss, this matter is none of your business. Take 2 steps back now." Sierra took a deep breath, remaining calm, and replied politely that she had no intention of interfering. However, Jennings did not accept her explanation, and with a look full of disdain commented, "You people always have an excuse for everything, right? Always wanting to meddle where you're not invited." Those words hit her hard. Sierra had been through similar situations before, but each new experience seemed worse than the previous one. Determined not to provoke further tension, Sierra took a few steps back, trying to dispel the bitter feeling that had overtaken her at that moment. As she slowly walked away, she heard Jennings murmur something to the other agent by his side, who laughed mockingly. She gripped her leather briefcase even tighter, feeling the knots in her fingers turn white from the tension. As she turned to continue her way to the Ascendant Air Premium Lounge, Jennings deliberately raised his voice, issuing a veiled threat. "And watch where you're going. I guarantee I can cuff you faster than you can say arrest." The provocation made her blood boil. For a moment, she thought of retaliating, but reason prevailed. She knew that any sassy response could only worsen the situation, especially coming from a black woman in an environment where people like Jennings always believed they were in complete control. With a lump in her throat and her face flushed with indignation, she continued toward the lounge, determined not to let that humiliation derail her important professional commitment for the day. Sierra entered the premium lounge, trying her best to regain the serenity that Jennings had stolen from her minutes earlier. The environment was a blend of elegance and modern comfort, with enormous windows offering a panoramic view of the runways for landing and takeoff. One could see Ascendant airplanes perfectly lined up, their silver fuselages gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, executive passengers enjoyed plush sofas, sophisticated drinks, and soft lighting that conveyed tranquility, exactly the opposite of the turmoil she had just witnessed outside. Michael Tan, the person in charge of managing the renovations, was patiently waiting at one of the tables, fiddling with a tablet while drinking his coffee. Michael was a young executive of Asian descent, always sporting a warm smile and a competence that Sierra admired. As soon as he noticed her arrival, he quickly stood up, displaying his habitual smile, but soon he realized something was different on Sierra's face. Without saying a word, he gestured toward the chair in front of him, as if he knew something was amiss. As Sierra slowly sat down, trying to organize her thoughts, Michael discreetly asked if everything was all right. She hesitated for a moment, torn between speaking out or just focusing on the project, but she knew she needed to vent in order to move forward with clarity. In a voice still laden with emotion, she briefly recounted the incident with Officer Jennings, carefully choosing each word. Michael listened intently, his expression oscillating between concern and indignation. At the end of her account, he took a deep breath and shook his head slowly, showing genuine solidarity. "I'm sorry, Sierra. It shouldn't have been like this. Not here, not anywhere." The silence between them lasted a few seconds, filled only by the subtle ambient sounds and the muffled noise of airplanes outside. It was in that brief moment of reflection that the lounge door abruptly opened, drawing the attention of everyone present. Sierra's heart tightened as she realized that entering was none other than Officer Jennings himself, now accompanied by another officer, clearly searching for someone. Jennings strode across the lounge with a provocative posture, his narrowed eyes scanning the room as if searching for a dangerous criminal. Sierra felt a sudden chill down her spine when she noticed that the officer was walking directly toward her, accompanied by a younger officer whose badge read Leroy. Leroy was a slim black man with a serious and cautious expression, visibly uncomfortable beside Jennings. As they both approached the table, Sierra noticed that all the conversations around had ceased, the other passengers discreetly watching the unfolding situation. Jennings stopped in front of her, crossing his arms with a triumphant air, while Leroy remained a step behind, keeping his gaze lowered, clearly embarrassed by the scene. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me to the security room," Jennings announced loudly, almost theatrically, attracting even more curious glances. Sierra felt her hands sweat and her stomach churn. It was evident that Jennings wanted to publicly humiliate her. Michael Tan quickly tried to intervene, calmly explaining that Sierra was there on official business, with full authorization from the airport administration. But Jennings gave no room for argument. In a mocking tone, he stated that Sierra had been caught on security cameras, invading restricted areas of the airport. Hearing those absurd words, Sierra felt her blood pounding in her temples. It was as if she were being accused before everyone, with no right to any defense. Even in the face of Michael's measured explanations, Jennings remained firm, refusing to listen to any justification. "Either you present now an authorization that justifies your presence there, or we'll have to settle this at the police station," he said, displaying evident arrogance. Sierra realized that arguing would be useless. The only way to confront that injustice was to resort to the measure she had always avoided, calling on her father's influence. With a trembling hand full of anger and frustration, she pulled the cell phone from the pocket of her white blazer and, without taking her eyes off Jennings's, dialed the personal number of Wesley Clark, the billionaire owner of Ascendant Air. When Jennings noticed the call, he smiled ironically, as if doubting the authenticity of the action. Sierra took a deep breath, determined to prove to him that he had messed with the wrong person. As soon as her father answered the phone, Sierra felt a mix of relief and tension in his voice. Wesley Clark, despite his reputation as a strict and imposing man in the business world, always adopted an affectionate and concerned tone when speaking with his only daughter. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" he asked with a certain anxiety, noticing that it wasn't common for Sierra to call in the middle of a workday, especially during important meetings. She tried to stay calm while describing the situation in a few clear words, explaining Officer Jennings's abusive behavior and how he was unjustly humiliating her in front of everyone. Upon hearing the account, Wesley immediately became furious, not only because of the injustice against his daughter, but because of the explicit arrogance that the officer displayed by discrediting her in public. In a firm and determined tone, he requested that the phone be handed directly to Officer Jennings. Still convinced that he was dealing with an ordinary woman, Jennings picked up the phone with a mocking smile, thinking that it was all just an act. However, it took only a few seconds for his expression to change drastically. The arrogant smile gave way to a visible pallor, and he shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard as he listened to the deep, authoritative voice of Wesley Clark, owner of the most influential airline in the United States. Wesley spared no words in reprimanding Jennings, stating that he would take immediate measures with those responsible for airport security. The officer, once so self-assured, now mumbled short and hesitant responses, unable to maintain his arrogant stance in the face of Wesley's real authority. After hanging up, Jennings was completely shaken, looking around the lounge as if searching for support or a quick escape from that humiliating situation. Sierra, for her part, felt a momentary sense of justice, yet she knew that this isolated victory did not erase the emotional trauma and injustice suffered moments before. As Jennings slowly walked away, embarrassed and defeated, Michael Tan looked at Sierra with a slight supportive smile, clearly impressed by the way everything had been resolved. However, Sierra felt a weight in her chest, aware that the experience would not end as easily as she had hoped. Jennings left the lounge in haste, still clutching his communication radio as if trying to recover from the humiliation he had just experienced. Leroy, the other officer, lingered for a few seconds, seemingly unsure whether he should follow him or approach Sierra. Finally, he took a step forward and spoke in a low tone, almost as if he didn't want to be overheard. "I'm sorry about that. It wasn't right." Before Sierra could respond, he turned his back and left the lounge, leaving a dense silence in the air. Michael, who had remained discreet until then, let out a long, relieved sigh. "That was intense," he commented, still processing what had just happened. Sierra forced a small smile, but the lump in her throat was still present. "Intense is an understatement," she replied, adjusting her posture in the chair. The adrenaline was starting to subside, but the discomfort remained. Knowing that she had only managed to resolve the situation because her father intervened bothered her more than she cared to admit. And what if it had been someone else? What if it had been that young black man she had seen being confronted earlier? She didn't have much time to process the situation, for she soon received a call from airport security. The sector supervisor, a man named Roger Klein, wanted to meet her in person to discuss the incident. Sierra agreed, knowing that it meant the story was already resonating within the airport administration. When Klein arrived at the lounge, he appeared visibly disturbed. Tall, with graying hair and a stern expression, he carried a tablet on which he made quick notes. "Ms. Clark, first of all, I want to express my apologies for the incident. This should not have happened, especially not to someone in a business position at the airport," he said, choosing his words carefully. Sierra realized that his concern was not only about the injustice, but also about the repercussions the case might bring to the airport. "It shouldn't happen to anyone," Sierra corrected him, not hiding her frustration. Klein hesitated for a second, then slowly nodded. "I understand. We are conducting an internal investigation into Officer Jennings's behavior. The administration will take appropriate measures." The bureaucratic response didn't surprise her, but it also didn't satisfy her. "I hope you do, because honestly, if I didn't have the Clark name, this matter would have ended very differently," she retorted. Klein said nothing, merely diverting his gaze to his tablet, while Sierra felt a growing determination inside her to ensure that this story wouldn't end there. Sierra knew she couldn't let the incident pass without consequences. She had spent years proving her worth in the corporate world, fighting for her competence to be recognized beyond her surname. But at that moment, it was clear that, for Jennings, she was nothing more than another black woman causing trouble. The difference was that she had the privilege and the resources to turn the situation in her favor, something that many others did not have. And that deeply troubled her. After Roger Klein left the lounge, Sierra grabbed her cell phone and opened her email. She quickly typed a detailed account of the incident and forwarded it directly to Ascendant Air's legal department, requesting that measures be taken not only against Jennings, but also against the flawed protocol that allowed such an event to occur. She didn't want just a suspension or an internal warning. She wanted real changes in the way airport security treated passengers, especially black people. Michael watched silently as she typed the email with nimble fingers, her face determined. When she finished and sent the message, he leaned a little toward her. "Do you think this will change anything?" Sierra looked at him, reflecting for a moment before answering. "I have to believe it will. If I do nothing, it's as if I'm accepting that this will keep happening." Michael nodded, seeming to understand the seriousness of what she was saying. Before they could continue the conversation, Sierra's phone vibrated on the table. It was a notification, a message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she felt a chill down her spine. The message read, "People like you should learn to stay in your place. Don't push your luck." Sierra's heart raced. What had started as an isolated incident at the airport now seemed to be turning into something bigger and more dangerous. She exchanged a quick glance with Michael, who immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, leaning in to see the phone. Sierra hesitated for a moment, then turned the screen toward him. Michael's expression hardened. "That's a threat," she nodded, feeling a cold flutter in her stomach. The problem now wasn't just about justice. It was about safety. And for the first time that day, Sierra felt that perhaps she had meddled in something much bigger than she had expected. Sierra felt a tightness in her chest as she held the phone. The threat was direct, without any beating around the bush. Someone didn't want her to pursue this matter further. She looked around the lounge, suddenly feeling vulnerable. Whoever had sent that message knew who she was and what she was doing. Michael noticed the tension on her face and immediately switched into alert mode. "You need to report this now, Sierra. This isn't just about Jennings. It's bigger than that." She knew he was right, but something inside her hesitated. Reporting it would mean exposing the situation even more, drawing further attention to something that was already taking on unexpected proportions. But at the same time, ignoring it could be a dangerous mistake. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of Ascendant Air's head of security, a man named Damian Ross, who worked directly with her father and was responsible for protecting the Clark family at events and strategic trips. Damian answered on the second ring, his voice firm and no nonsense. "Sierra, I just got an update about what happened with that officer at the airport. Are you okay?" His concern was genuine, and it made her feel a bit safer. "I'm okay, but I just received a worrying message." She read the threat aloud, listening as Damian took a deep breath on the other end of the line. "This isn't something any random hater would do. Someone wants you to stay quiet. I'm on my way to the airport now. Don't leave the lounge until I get there." The urgency in his tone made Sierra realize just how serious the situation really was. Michael, who had been listening to the conversation, crossed his arms and nodded. "This has gone beyond just a security issue. Someone behind the scenes is trying to silence you." Sierra swallowed hard. Up until that moment, she had been handling everything rationally, but now the feeling of danger was palpable. For the first time that day, fear began to mix with indignation. She wasn't exactly sure whom she was up against, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. Sierra tried to remain calm while waiting for Damian to arrive. The lounge, once a sophisticated and tranquil refuge, now felt too small and oppressive. Her eyes scanned the environment, analyzing every person around her. Could it be a passenger, an airport employee, or perhaps someone from security, trying to protect her on the surface while working against her behind the scenes? The uncertainty left her uneasy. Michael, noticing her tension, was typing something frantically on his phone. "I'm sending this message to a contact in the cybersecurity sector. Maybe they can trace where this threat came from." Sierra nodded, grateful that he was by her side, but she knew she needed something more concrete. Suddenly, her phone vibrated again. With a knot in her stomach, she looked at the screen. An unknown number. This time, the message was even more direct. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Leave the airport now." Her heart raced. Before she could react, the lounge door opened with a sharp impact. Damian Ross entered, dressed in a dark suit and sunglasses, his imposing presence dominating the space. He scanned the area with a trained eye, quickly identifying Sierra and heading straight toward her. "Show me the messages," he ordered, his tone firm yet not causing unnecessary panic. Sierra handed over the phone, and he examined each word with a serious look. "This is coordinated. It's not a random threat," he concluded. He looked at Michael. "Did you send that to someone?" Michael nodded. "I'm trying to trace the number." Damian nodded, but his priority was clear. "Sierra, we're leaving now. The security protocol has changed." She frowned. "Do you want me to go home?" Damian paused before answering. "No. Your father wants you to go to a safe location, but that doesn't mean you should back down. We're going to handle this the right way. We just need to make sure you're not caught off guard." Sierra felt a wave of relief and frustration simultaneously. She didn't want to run. She wanted to resolve it. But looking at Damian, she realized that the situation was bigger than she thought. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was only beginning to understand the true depth of the problem she had just exposed. Damian wasted no time. He grabbed the radio clipped to his belt and said something quickly in code, while his eyes swept the lounge as if already identifying possible threats. "We have a vehicle waiting outside, but we can't exit through the front. If someone is watching you, they'll be expecting exactly that." Sierra shivered, realizing the seriousness of the situation. She wasn't the type to get frightened easily, but there was something in Damian's tone that made her understand he had dealt with this kind of thing before. He turned to Michael. "You're coming with us. If that unknown number manages to trace you as well, I'd rather we all stay within the same security perimeter." Michael didn't argue. merely grabbing his briefcase and standing up. "If we're doing this, I want to see how I can help." Damien nodded and signaled for them to follow him. They discreetly exited through the back of the lounge, crossing a service corridor where airport staff were moving about with trays and cleaning equipment. Damien maintained his rigid posture, walking briskly and always one step ahead. "Stay alert. If you see anything unusual, let me know immediately." Sierra took a deep breath, feeling her whole body on high alert. It was surreal that in just a few hours, her trip to the airport had turned into this. When they reached a side exit of the terminal, a black SUV was already waiting with its engine running. Damien opened the rear door. "Get in." Sierra hesitated for a moment, looking around before ducking down and entering the car. Michael followed right behind, and Damien took the passenger seat, speaking in a low voice to the driver. As soon as the door closed, Sierra felt the tension in the air increase. She didn't know exactly where they were going, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just a matter about Jennings or what had happened at the airport. Something bigger was happening, and now she was right at its center. The black SUV glided smoothly away from the airport, merging into the city traffic. Sierra looked out the window, trying to spot any car that might appear suspicious, but Damien had already anticipated that. "The vehicle is armored, and the route we're taking is not predictable. If anyone is following us, we'll know," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Michael, sitting next to her, checked his phone. "My contact in cybersecurity sent me an update. The number that sent you the message was registered with a prepaid SIM, with no owner identified, but they managed to trace the last activation location, inside the airport itself." Sierra shivered. That meant the person who sent the threat was much closer than they had imagined. So it's not just someone external keeping tabs on the case. It's someone who was there, perhaps even saw everything happen, she said, her voice firm but laden with unease. Damien exchanged a quick glance with Michael in the rearview mirror. "That confirms what I suspected. This threat didn't come from just an opportunist on the internet, someone who saw the repercussion and wanted to intimidate. We're dealing with someone who has access, who understands the inner workings of the airport, and knew exactly where and when to approach you." Sierra ran her hand over her forehead, feeling the weight of that revelation. "And you think they're connected to Jennings?" Damien leaned back slightly, considering the question. "I can't say for sure yet, but something tells me that the problem goes beyond a racist officer trying to impose his authority. This message was a warning, and when someone sends a warning, it means they have something to lose." Those words echoed in Sierra's mind. With every passing minute, she understood that she was not just facing an isolated incident of discrimination. She had touched on something much larger, and now she was under the radar of those who wanted everything to stay exactly as it always was. The car finally turned onto a quiet street, away from the city center, and stopped in front of a modern mansion, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. When the vehicle door opened, Sierra was immediately greeted by 2 security guards dressed in black with headphones. They escorted her through a side entrance, a discreet door that led to an office with glass-paneled walls. Damien was already ahead, giving some instructions to the driver, while Michael, silently, followed right behind Sierra. She didn't know exactly where she was, but her intuition told her that she was in a safe place. The office was spacious, with minimalist furniture, and a large dark wooden table dominated the center. At the back of the room, a window showcased a view of a well-kept garden. For a moment, she felt disconnected from the chaos outside. Everything seemed surreal, like a movie she was watching from a distance. After a brief conversation with the local security team, Damien indicated a chair for Sierra and another for Michael. "Make yourselves comfortable for now," he said, before stepping away to make a few phone calls. Michael sat down, still worried but calmer than before. "Are you okay?" he asked, observing Sierra's expression. She looked at him, forcing a smile. "I'm okay. Just trying to process all of this." "I don't know how to react, Michael. What started as a simple work visit to the airport turned into a nightmare." He shook his head in understanding. "You're stronger than you think, and as much as it feels like a nightmare right now, you're doing the right thing. This is going to change a lot more than you imagine." Michael's words touched Sierra more deeply than she had expected, but she knew she couldn't do it all alone. She knew that the fight was just beginning. And now, she had to ensure that what happened to her wouldn't remain merely a matter of personal revenge, but would transform into something bigger, something that could impact the way airport security treated people like her. She looked out the window once more. The battle for justice was far from won, but she was determined to see it through to the end. As the night advanced, the atmosphere in the office grew tenser. Sierra felt exhausted, but she couldn't stop. She knew that even at that moment, something was still happening, a reaction to everything she had exposed. During the past hours, Damien had contacted the airport's legal and security teams, while Michael was searching for ways to increase Sierra's security. But there was more at stake than mere protective measures. "You're going to need to be careful in the coming days," Damien said when he returned to the room, his tone more serious than ever. "I recommend that you avoid giving interviews or making statements for now. Any move you make could be interpreted the wrong way, given the polarization surrounding this case." Sierra knew he was right, but at the same time, she couldn't hide. She couldn't back down now. Systemic racism wouldn't be solved by silence, and if she fled the situation now, it would be like accepting the status quo. She sighed, looking at the papers spread out on the table in front of her. "I know what I need to do," she replied, more firmly than she felt. "But you're right. I need to take it one step at a time." Michael watched her with respect, knowing that despite all the pressure, she wouldn't give up. "It's not just about the incident with Jennings. This is just the tip of the iceberg. All of this is going to reverberate." Sierra nodded, her eyes fixed on the paper before her. "I know, but I also know I can't let this go. I want something good to come out of this. I want change to start here." Damien, who was standing at the back, paused for a moment, listening to her words. He knew that she wasn't just speaking about the incident, but about a movement. "You're about to make history," he said, his gaze reflecting a mixture of admiration and caution. Sierra felt the weight of responsibility descend on her shoulders. She knew that the consequences of her actions would be significant, but what scared her the most was what would happen to others, the people who didn't have the same protection she did. What would happen to the young men who, just like the guy at the airport, were being mistreated every day? As she thought about it, her mind returned to the moments when, in silence, she wondered if she could really change something, not just for herself, but for everyone on the margins. She was beginning to understand that this fight wasn't just about her own name or her family's image. It was a struggle for something deeper, something that transcends any privilege. And now, more than ever, she was ready for that battle. In the following days, Sierra's situation worsened. The media began covering the airport incident intensely, but, as Damien had predicted, interpretations were divided. On one side, there were those who saw her stance as an example of courage, a powerful, influential woman who wouldn't be silenced in the face of oppression. On the other, there was a wave of criticism, with some accusing Sierra of using her surname as a get-out-of-jail-free card for behavior that others, without the same privilege, couldn't afford to display. Social media was filled with heated debates. The hashtag #ThourJusticeForSierra spread quickly, but it was soon followed by "Ye and privileged Sierra," a merciless reaction from detractors who saw her as someone who didn't deserve the same treatment as everyone else. Public opinion polarization affected her, but Sierra knew it wouldn't stop her. She was determined to use her visibility to spark a dialogue about the issues she faced, regardless of the criticisms. She began meeting more with lawyers and civil rights experts, seeking an effective way to turn what had happened into something lasting, something that went beyond simply punishing an officer. She wanted reforms in airport procedures, mandatory training for all security staff on issues of racial discrimination, and an internal audit of security processes. But the more she delved into the world of policies and strategies, the more she realized how deep the system she was trying to change truly was. Racially, she knew there was a huge difference in the treatment of people based on their appearance and social status. Yet the resistance she encountered was more complex than she had imagined. There were those who, even in the face of evidence, argued that the issue was an exception, an isolated error, and that what happened to Sierra was nothing more than a case of misinterpretation. She knew that this type of argument was part of a pattern that needed to be broken. One afternoon, upon returning from one of those meetings with the lawyers, Sierra was surprised by a call from Wesley Clark. Her father, ever pragmatic and focused on results, wanted to know how she was handling the growing pressure. "Sierra, it's important that you don't lose sight of the objective. I'm not asking you to give up, but to think strategically. I'll support you, but we need more than just public reactions. We need real solutions. Those words hit her directly. She knew he was right. What she was doing wasn't just about setting an example or seeking justice for herself. It was about creating a path for others to follow, and more importantly, so that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same kind of systematic discrimination she had encountered that day. She looked out the window of her office, with the city of Atlanta sprawling before her, and felt a new determination take hold of her. It was time to move beyond emotional reactions. It was time to make the changes she wanted to see in the world. With that new perspective in mind, Sierra began working with a team of social justice and public policy specialists. She knew that her position placed her in a place of influence, but she also knew that this could be a heavy burden. It wasn't just about using her surname to ensure that the incident with Jennings was resolved. The most important thing was that she could help build a system that took into account everyone's experiences, not just those of people in privileged positions. She found herself in long meetings, often accompanied by skeptical looks and difficult conversations, but over time, she began earning respect. Her pragmatic approach and genuine dissatisfaction with superficial responses started to build a network of allies within the system who, gradually, accepted that deep changes were necessary. Meanwhile, the courts began addressing Jennings's case. The pressure increased day by day. Sierra knew that a 6-month suspension wasn't enough, but it was still a sign that things were moving. What bothered her, however, was the fact that he would still remain part of the airport security system after his punishment. She felt that although she had won one battle, the war was far from over. It was at that moment that she realized something important. The justice and security system wouldn't change completely with just a few superficial reforms. She would need to go further, becoming not just a critical voice, but also an active advocate for the structural changes that were necessary. One night, while resting at home, she received an unexpected phone call. It was Jennings, the officer who had treated her with disdain at the airport. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice calmer than she had imagined. "I was arrogant and ignorant. I saw something in you that made me act completely wrong, and after all this investigation I realized it was all because of my own prejudices." Sierra fell silent for a moment, surprised by the apology. Although she had prepared herself to hear empty apologies, the sincerity in Jennings's words made her reflect. He wasn't apologizing just for the episode at the airport, but for something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath before responding. "I appreciate your words, Jennings, but what really matters is what you do from now on. Real change doesn't happen only when things become public. It has to happen within us first." She hung up the phone, feeling that no matter how many victories she had achieved, there was still a long road ahead. What followed was a period of intense reflection and action for Sierra. She spent the following weeks working tirelessly to develop training programs for security agents, focusing on reducing racial bias and ensuring a more humane treatment of passengers. She allied herself with civil rights organizations and instituted a series of workshops within the airport, involving everyone from the police officers to the TSA attendants. The program was an initial success, and the impact of the first training sessions was evident, but what she couldn't foresee was the reach her story would have. As more people joined her cause, others began to feel empowered to share their own stories of discrimination. It was then that Sierra realized that her fight was not isolated. She wasn't just changing the dynamics at Atlanta's airport. She was helping to spark a national dialogue about systemic discrimination in both public and private spaces. At that moment, Sierra felt a sense of fulfillment, not because she had won the battle against Jennings or achieved something personal, but because she knew she'd created a platform for silenced voices to be heard. What began as a simple fight for personal justice turned into a movement. She was becoming an unwavering advocate for equality, not just in the airline sector, but anywhere discrimination still existed. "It's not the end," she thought. "It's just the beginning." Sierra's effort didn't stop in the airport meeting room. She took the case to Congress, presenting a legislative proposal to monitor and regulate discriminatory practices at all public security and transportation points in the country. The story of her fight, with all its challenges and victories, began to gain visibility nationwide, and although the path was long and full of obstacles, she knew that she was doing something that truly mattered. It was on a Saturday morning, while she was reading the news about the latest debates on her proposal, that the phone rang again. It was Wesley Clark. "I saw the results of the latest votes, daughter. You're doing very well. But remember, Patience is needed to see real change. We're not stopping, okay? Sierra smiled, feeling the strength of those words. She knew her father was right. True change didn't happen overnight, but with each small step, she was helping to open doors to a fairer future. And while that future still seemed distant, she was more determined than ever to keep moving forward.